Hello, my name is Faye Ballerino, and I would like to take this time to talk about a little bit of the key themes in Kriti Sharma's book Interdependence, and specifically about how she uses the concept of contingentism within the book, and just explore a little bit about what applications this might have outside of just the philosophical or the academic realm, and more how she connects it to scientific properties, collective experience, and just contingentism as a practice, what this might mean for us as human beings that exist in this world of experiences, which I think is really the premise of the book. How human beings, as we interact with each other and the world around us, can reach this more holistic understanding of interdependence from both a biological and also a social perspective, maybe even a more philosophical or immaterial one. Um, so to get started, I would like to talk about exactly what contingentism is in her definition and why she chooses to use it in this way. So, in the concept of contingentism, is Sharma discusses it in this book. Um, it basically is the idea that things and stuff in the universe has no inherent properties. Everything is dependent on each other, especially through experience. So, as conscious human beings, we reach an understanding of the world through our experiences. And even though each experience is individual, we can identify some patterns or similarities. And we choose to mutually agree upon these terms to classify things and classify our interactions with the world. But these are not inherent properties of the things, which is the point that she's really trying to drive home in this book. So, from a scientific perspective, we'll start off by discussing this and what it could potentially mean for our understanding of the world around us. Through like how we perceive things, like through sensing and those modes of interaction, like whether it's through the transfer of energy between like two organisms or even on like a molecular level, we can understand how experiences affect two objects or beings that interact with each other and how it ultimately changes them, but still allows them to keep their properties in this sort of mutable, interconnected way. So, in the first section of the book, Sharma spends a lot of time talking about um, examples of this. On page 27, she gives the example of the properties of a copper wire and their electrical conductivity, and which is a measurable quantity. And she is using this to give a relationship between theory and measurement. What this means is we can make predictions based on our understanding of the scientific world, based on what's measurable or observable, such as like the copper atoms being able to conduct electricity, using that to kind of extrapolate our understandings to larger scale theories. But she really wants us to understand that even though we can observe this property and reasonably extrapolate it based on how it behaves, um, these properties are not inherent or intrinsic to what we perceive. Um, And then later in the book, in page 33, she talks again about how we can try to understand the universe and the phenomena that occur in it from a place of uh, observing the order and the patterns that we can predict in it and explain. However, she does say that, again, all of these interactions are able to take place in our understanding because these phenomena arise contingently and not intrinsically. So, to put that in simpler terms, we can only make these predictions or explain things about the world based on our experience of the interactions between them and how they affect each other in this experience rather than being able to quantify or um, claim that anything is an intrinsic property of an object or a thing. We can only observe it through how it affects other things, more like a cause and effect kind of understanding of the world through our senses. Um, and then she kind of brings this back to more of a metaphorical explanation of collective experience. She calls the world a soft edged place where we can only identify patterns based on collective experience. Um, However, this is simply based on like a collective agreement of people who experience things and coordinate with other members of the community or social members um, to form like a general understanding of the real shared world. Um, she also really emphasizes the collective creation of the world. She uses a quote by Francisco Valera on page 34, which talks about the importance of collective experience to bring forth the world as a process of living itself. Um, so here it's just really driving home the point that even though we might have what seems like concrete, scientific, observable phenomenon, um, this is really just part of an understanding that we have agreed to rather than properties of the things themselves. Um, and we can use this information to predict how they might behave in interaction with each other. Like, for example, the copper atoms, we might be able to predict that they'll behave similarly based on their interactions with electricity and their conductivity, but we can never claim that that is an inherent property of them since uh, the world itself is mutable and subject to change. It's merely like a rough collective classification of patterns that we have agreed upon as true or mostly true as a society. So this is also just a product of humanity's natural tendency to view things with, as she puts it on page 33, through smudged contact lenses. Um, just as human beings, we understand things in ourselves only to in our relation to others. That's how we figure out our like boundaries, both socially and in a way, kind of where we end and something else begins, by identifying these patterns, by classifying them, by seeing how they overlap or how they differentiate. But again, that's ultimately a flawed perspective, since it centers so heavily around personal perception and personal experience. Even collectively, there can never be that element of certainty or inherence, and we should be careful not to fall into that logical pitfall, because knowing itself is interdependent on our experiences, and how we gather knowledge at its core is through those lived experiences, which are ultimately not objective, they're subjective. We can only measure what may be objective, like science, through our observable sensing experiences. Um, so this kind of brings me to the last point of contingentism as a practice and why it's important. So contingentism, avoiding the trap of falling into the logical pitfall of intrinsic properties or qualities, questions how these things come into being and how they're connected holistically, striving to have the most complete picture of experiences possible. So I feel like what was most impactful in my understanding of this book really takes place in conclusion, kind of in the last couple 5 pages or so of the book. This really helped me understand how both calling back to the idea of objects as being dependent on subjects and processes, and like the transfer of energy and interaction between subjects, um, and how this shows like change and mutability. Um, it also really drives home the point for me that we should be looking at things from place of wanting to understand how they connect to other processes. For example, earlier in the book, Sharma talks about the process of eating an apple, but instead of just observing the apple before you, she encourages us to think about how the apple got there, like the process in which it was grown, how it was transported. Even as you're consuming the apple, um, and having that energy transferred to you, where do we draw the boundaries between things? What, how do things interact with each other and change each other, and then um transform from one thing, an apple, that's before you consume it, to something else like excrement? Where do we draw the boundaries between these processes or things and say, um, these things can exist within each other and interact with each other and still remain separate, or have their own um, essence, really? How do we define that? Part of that is by taking into account, like from an ecological perspective, how things interact even in like a symbiotic relationship, or the environment. Anyways, the specifics that she give are important to understanding this, but it's not so much about the specific examples, but rather just understanding how we can begin to unlabel things and processes through recognizing mutual dependence, and the influence of other things in the environment upon our understanding of an object or a thing. There's also ontological interdependence, um, which is the view that things only exist as things dependent on other things. This is kind of related to that idea of mutual dependence that brings other things into being, like we talked about earlier. The idea of like creating a living world that brings other things in the world into being, where it's things are not just connected but dependent on each other for existence, whether that's from an ecological perspective, like a source of energy or food, or some other ecological interaction, but just questioning the positionality of things as a practice and what do they depend on, understanding their origins as well as their interactions with each other, whether that's in our personal interactions, or individual interactions as human beings or in a society, or from an ecological perspective. It works to combine all of these aspects, just as a practice that people use to understand the world. And I think that's the biggest takeaway I have from this book, really. Just that we live in a world of experiences dependent on each other and the things existing within it. There's this interlocking or interconnectedness of things within the world from a biological or scientific perspective, but also more philosophical or abstract standpoint, which is where the fancy big word of contingentism comes in. This overlap of like material, scientific, and observable phenomena that we can sense and that we can perceive, and a more mystical way of viewing the world and its experiences or interaction from a philosophical or even a more spiritual perspective. But to me, the best takeaway of this book is the practice of being a mindful observer, of asking how things are connected and how they depend on each other for this holistic perspective of a dynamic and an ever changing world. Um, and we can see that in our personal landscape as we interact with others, we're changed by others, we're constantly mutable. We can see that in ourselves, but we should also strive to like be able to understand the processes that create the world that we live in and ultimately influence us, as members of the world that we live in. um, so if I was to pitch this book to someone or try to argue why it was important, I would say that the bridge that I would use between the book and the general public is why it's important not to fall into the assumption of things being inherent both to people and objects. Um, and just the importance of experience, not to undermine that or to almost take it for granted is an objective truth. I think we should constantly be questioning our own place in the world, and its like subjectivity. I think that the scientific examples that she uses in this book are just a more minute way to give like a real grounded perspective to this ongoing process that takes place within ourselves as we question things and we discover new things and we learn new things. And this is predicated on our past experiences of the world, our understanding of the world. But with this knowledge, we should use it and take it forward of us into the future when we think about how do we arrive at these biases of understanding? How do we think about these other things that are present in our world? How did we get here to really understand how we should move forward, or how we personally process and classify things, contributing to that collective experience? And I really think that that is the most important message of this book. And I value that perspective and the ability that Sharma has in this book to truly question everything about how we understand things, from the smallest organisms like algae, or even the interactions between atoms or molecules, to how we organize our society and that understanding within it. So, uh, thank you for taking the time to kind of hang out here with me and discuss this. And hopefully, this was helpful in your understanding of interdependence and what it might mean to you in the future, or currently means to you in this day and moment. Thank you.